Is there anybody here who was not here yesterday? Okay. We have a survey for the women's ministry if you get an opportunity to. Yeah, there you go. Walk with Shane. No. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their schedule to be at the ladies' retreat. I've heard just beautiful comments from so many about mostly we needed this. Whoa, we needed this. And I know I needed it. And I just want to thank all the ladies for coming and all the ladies who helped put it together. Aunt's the one who really had the push, and I appreciate her so much for that. And she got it going. And of course, Aunt and Aspen delivered two really, really wonderful lessons. Oh, you weren't there, Tafina. If you get an opportunity to no, there's no shame. I just want to let you, that's not a shame thing. I just want you to know that if you have an opportunity, it's online, so you can go hear the lessons are really, really, really good. So a great deal of energy, time and energy goes into putting those together. And that was put together pretty quickly. And I'm very impressed with how everybody came together and made it work. So the theme, as we know, was be still and know, which of course comes from the passage in Psalm 46, which we read several times over the last couple of days. And there's so many beautiful, beautiful thoughts that came out through those lessons. And Aunt started us off yesterday by challenging us just to be quiet, to shush ourselves, to shush our minds, to be still. And she reminded us that quietness before God acknowledges his sovereignty, that silence shows that we are grounded in faith, that he is our God, and he is our God when times are good, and he is our God when times are bad. But we align ourselves with God's will in our silence. And while the world around us is in turmoil, you hear complaining, screaming, justifying themselves, all sorts of noise we hear in this world. We are calm, and we are at peace, and we are silent. And that silence defies human logic. It's not the way people act. And we know that it only is from God. And it talked about the importance of head knowledge, that we need knowledge. And Addie's been doing a beautiful job in her Sunday class too, as she talks about the importance of knowing God and the knowledge of God. But Anne reminded us that we can't stay there. It's not just knowledge. She gave us the example of Moses and how he knew God. We know that he knew God, but he didn't always respond correctly. And Moses hadn't learned early on to be still, and he took matters into his own hands. And we know in Exodus 2 how in his frustration and anger, he ended up killing an Egyptian. And of course, he had to flee for his life. And then when years later, 40 years later, when he saw God in the burning bush, he still didn't quite know the meaning of being still, because when God came to talk to Moses, Moses and asked him to go talk to Pharaoh. God came to Moses and asked him to talk to Pharaoh. Moses wouldn't have it. He argued and pleaded with God. Just that thought right there makes me go, it just sounds brazen to argue with God, but he argued. And then he said, I'm slow of tongue, right? And God said, I made your tongue. I made your mouth, right? I'll be there. I'll give you the words. And it wasn't enough. He still continued to complain and say, I can't do this. And God gave him signs to show how powerful he is. And Moses still argued with God and said, I can't do this. Let my brother go with me. And Aunt pointed out that if he truly knew who God was, he would know that God would carry him, but that that somehow in all of this, Moses didn't know God because God wasn't enough for him. He had to ask for his brother. And it pointed out how ludicrous that is, that he wanted a man to go with him because God wasn't enough. Moses was continuing to rely on himself, and therefore we see that he really didn't have peace in his life. But Moses didn't stay there, and we know he didn't stay there. And this is such a great part of the story. Because of his obedience, he changed, he grew, and eventually, in Numbers chapter 12, we can read that God called him the most humble man on the face of the earth. That's a big change. We know that through that time, Moses learned to be still, and he really learned who God was. And also talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These three young Hebrew slaves, these three young men who were removed from their families, who were removed from everything familiar to them, who were removed from all the encouragement and everything that they had that was good in their lives, taken into a very ungodly country and being around ungodly people. But we know from their story that these three knew God. They knew God, and they didn't just know God. They had learned to be still before him because they knew who he was and they knew what he was capable of. And we know the story, this great story of the fiery furnace. Incredible, it's just an incredible story. And they had refused, the king had set up this great idol for them to bow down and worship, and all the people had to bow down, and they refused, and the king was absolutely beside himself with fury. And in Daniel 3:13, it says, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the men were brought before the king. And he actually gave him another opportunity. Now, when you hear these instruments, I want you to bow down. But if you don't, Nebuchadnezzar said, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. It's a great reply. We don't need to defend ourselves in this matter. If we're thrown into a blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us. He will deliver us from your hands, but even if he doesn't deliver us, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up. Incredible. They had nobody around them to sit there and say, to see if they were, doing the right thing. They had no encouragement. I mean, how many times do we get alone and sneak and do the things that we shouldn't do because nobody's watching? They had no encouragement. They didn't beg. They didn't plead. They didn't rationalize. And I like that point that,
We could bend our heads down.
Yes.
And know that as we're doing that, we're praying to our God.
Yeah.
And saying, we are just doing this. We could rationalize. I was trying to think of all I try to rationalize in my life in order to blend in with the world, to be okay with the world.
And I thought that was such a great point, such a good point, because we could just bow down and pretend. We could just pray to our God, and nobody will know the difference, right? They were silent, except to acknowledge their God. No pleading, no nothing else. They knew their God, and they knew what he was capable of doing. And the knowledge of who their God is brought obedience, and it brought them peace. They didn't seem like they were terrified. Didn't say they were terrified. Their faith and their silence made God look good. It helped people to see who God is. And eventually, because we know the rest of the story, the most powerful king on earth acknowledged the true God of heaven. Anne's lesson was very powerful and very convicting to me, and I really highly ask you to take the time to listen if you haven't heard it. But one of the take homes from this lesson is that sometimes a testimony of faith is silence before God. I really needed to hear that. Then Aspen had the afternoon lesson. And Aspen started off by reminding us of the context of this verse. And I thought that was really, really, really good. Robert actually, he brought it up today too, because obviously it hit him too. Be still and know that I'm God. We imagine that phrase being in the midst of a very peaceful and serene surrounding, that if that's taken out of context and you don't know what the context of the verse is, you can just imagine, David and the green pastures right? He just imagines something very calm. But when you read the passage, it's not in the midst of a peaceful place. Psalms 46 talks about the earth giving way. It talks about crumbling foundations. It talks about the mountains falling into the sea. It talks of earthquakes and raging storms and nations in an uproar, kingdoms falling, wars and desolations on earth. He lays out some of our greatest fears. And in the middle of that, he says, be still and know that I am God. Aspen reminded us that this phrase, be still, means release and relax. Cease the striving. Let go. In the midst of turmoil and in the midst of chaos, God says, I'm enough. He steps in and he says, enough. I'm enough. We are not enough. So come, he says, come rest on me and I will take care of you. Aspen reminded us that we tend to struggle with this aspect of being enough. We do. The lies that Satan throws out at us keep us fearful and worried and weary, but we're fearful of the wrong things. We talked about the fear of God this morning, but we get fearful of man, this fear of man. These lies, they rob us of our joy and they rob us of our peace. One of the lies that Satan stirs up inside of us is this need to be self-reliant. It's very much connected to our culture. I mean, we get brought up in all of our lives, this idea of independence and self-reliance. Somehow we're able to acknowledge and trust God with our salvation, but when it comes time to trust him with the details of our everyday lives, we think, oh, I got that, right? We say to ourselves, God is enough. And then we spend our time and our money trying to prove that we are enough. But God offers us so much more. When we learn to be still, we learn that we don't have to be enough because he is enough. Aspen gave this really beautiful illustration of flowers, and she had a picture of flowers in a vase, and she had flowers in a pot of dirt, and they were both very beautiful. But she said, eventually these ones in the vase who are just cut flowers, they're going to fade and they're going to die because they have nothing there to sustain them. They'll last a little while, but eventually they'll be gone. But the ones in the pot and in the dirt can continue to grow, and they'll have periods of time where things will die away, but then they'll continue to grow. And she said that we have to stay grounded in the truth. It's so important to stay grounded in the truth. We must stay still before God so that we can continue to tell ourselves the truth, because we're going to hear the lies. We're going to hear the lies from Satan, and we're going to hear the lies from the world around us. And we've got to be grounded so that we can continue to tell ourselves the truth. She said, if the gospel relied on me, it wouldn't be good news. Isn't that true? This life is not about us. It's an important lesson for us to learn, because the sooner that we learn that life is not about us, we'll have a better life. we will have a better life. The better our life gets, when we learn that it's not about us, the better our life gets. We have to get ourselves out of the way. Aspen reminded us in Luke 1, when the angel told Mary that she was going to have a baby, and not just any baby. No, you're going to have the Son of God is going to be the baby you're going to have. That Mary's response was powerful, powerful. Mary's response was, I'm a servant of the Lord. Let it be as you say. A still heart is content with whatever God gives you. This is the lesson that I needed desperately to hear. Remember, we talked about how this be still means a release, a cease from striving, letting go. Mary didn't immediately go into, oh, how can I do this? What are people going to say? Are you sure? I mean, I'm not good enough for that. Well, are you sure? I mean, she didn't go into any of this turmoil that we tend to go into. I know that, like Aspen talked about, the turmoil being asked to speak. And I have gone through that so many times over the years that I finally kind of had a pact with God where I said, if you want me to speak, you have somebody ask me to speak, I will say yes, so I don't have to go through the turmoil. So I know it's from him. But she didn't go through this turmoil. She just said, I'm a servant of the Lord. Let it be as you say. Oh, if I can only remember that. If I can only remember that. Stop striving. Let go. Be still. Be at peace. A still heart is content with whatever God gives you. Then in 1 Kings chapter 17, Aspen talked about the widow of Zarephath. Aspen said that she reminded us about the widow, and I think probably everybody knows the story, but she was in a desperate situation because she wasn't just a widow, she was a widow living in famine. I mean, she really had no way to support herself, but now she's in famine. And of course, we know that Elijah came, the prophet of God came, and she's just got a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, and he says, take your little bit of flour and oil and make me something to eat. I keep thinking about a mother of a child and how hard that would be if you only had enough left for one more meal. Most mothers are going to want their child to have it. This took a great deal of faith and trust in God for this widow. She was in a desperate situation, but she took her last bit of oil and her last bit of flour and she made food for God's servant. She laid down her own needs to do the task that God had set before her. This is definitely a takeaway from Aspen's lesson for me. This is a really huge lesson and one that I need to remind myself of. Sometimes God lays things in front of us that we don't want to do, and sometimes our own will gets crossed and we go through a struggle. I need to learn to do this. Romans 5:3-5 tells us that we are supposed to rejoice in our sufferings. I'm not good at that. I liked also how she talked about Elizabeth Elliot's and the do the next thing. I think that I have found myself saying that to myself, ever since actually I got to read her lesson a couple of days before. So I've been saying it for a few days. Do the next thing, Carol. Just do the next thing. You get caught up in the middle of whatever and it feels overwhelming. Just do the next thing. And just doing the next thing will bring that peace in the chaos. Aspen reminded us that the only thing we have to do is to trust our living God. So I want to interject one of my own thoughts in here because this is what I was thinking about when she was talking, because I just can't help but think about Mary and Martha when in this lesson. In Luke 10, now as they were on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, and it will not be taken away from her. It took me years and years to understand this passage. I think part of it had to be just living life. Because I remember reading that and I'm like, but if she didn't fix the meal, it wouldn't get put on the table. I mean, I really struggled with that. But of course, the point of the lesson is there's only one thing that's necessary in our lives. We get so caught up in so many things, and we just get overwhelmed and think we got to do this, and we got to do this, and we got to do this, and we got to do this. And it really all boils down to one thing. One thing. And we said that this morning, and Robert said this morning in his lesson, the whole of man. Fear God and keep his commandments. And of course, what is the greatest commandment? The greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it in that passage in Matthew says, all the other commandments in the entire Bible hang on that. Everything else, he simplifies it and brings it all down to one thing. And if we just do nothing else, we've got this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. We get caught up in the turmoil, but one thing is necessary. Love God. Fear him. Keep his commandments. Serve him. Trust him. Get to know him. It's the only thing that's necessary. Aspen reminded us that we just don't see the big picture. I remember years ago when I was doing a lesson, and the illustration, I guess it was in a book I was reading, was talking about how life is kind of like a parade, and we stand on the sidelines and we see the parade going by, and if we look, we can see a little bit on this end and a little bit on this end, but we can't see what goes around the corners. But God's up in the blimp. He sees the entire parade from beginning to end, and he knows exactly what's going to happen. And that illustration is really helpful for me because we have such a limited vision on everything that's going on, but God sees the big picture. And that's why it's so important to trust him. That's a huge part of why it's so important to trust him. She reminded us of that really wonderful story, 2 Kings 6, where Elisha and his servant was just terrified because the enemy was coming upon them. And Elisha, who obviously knew how to be still before God, had total peace. He was not concerned. His servant was just trembling because he's like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Elisha said, don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And of course, what's he talking about? Did he have a great army? No, he's talking about God. And he says, he prayed to God, and he says in 2 Kings 6, verse 17, open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked up, and he saw that the hills were full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. It's this little tiny glimpse that we get in Scripture of the spiritual world around us that we don't see because we don't see the whole picture, but it is there. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And that is true for us today, too. Aspen reminded us that God included our hardships in his plan. And sometimes it's hard to think through and think about. He assigned us our lot in life, and our troubles do not take him by surprise. And he did this for our own good, always, always. Everything he does is for our good. So the conclusion of Aspen's lesson, how are we to be still in turmoil and distress? Well, we get to know God, and then we respond to God. And we respond to Satan's lies with truth. We glory in our weakness because God says his power is made perfect in our weaknesses. Such a great verse, such a comforting verse. We stop trying to prove our worth and that we are enough. We respond to God when we are weary and we are bewildered with obedience and trust. We don't chase approval or comfort, and I'll add, and the praise of man. We bring our scraps and our sufferings, and we offer them to God. We be still, and we get to know God, and we know that he is God. And we allow Jesus to so capture our hearts and our gaze that we don't want anything else. I want to thank both these ladies for their wonderful lessons. I was convicted strongly, and like I told you before, I had read the lessons ahead of time, and I was still deeply convicted through them. And I really hope and pray that this has been a good weekend for you. If we have a few minutes, 2 or 3, anybody have any comments or anything that I would love to hear your takeaways. Anybody have a quick takeaway?
In our discussion group, we kind of contrasted like things that we think of being still, when we're talking about what does it being still look like, and we can think of like a secluded place with no distractions, unplugged, but also we were talking about just like those split-second moments when we want to intervene in a situation, or we want to jump to action, where we feel overwhelmed or whatever. Like those split seconds are very important to release and to relax on God, to be still in those. And there's a balance of refueling yourself and getting to know God in quiet moments, so that when life's not quiet and life's not like when life looks like Psalms 46 more so we know how to choose to be still.
Yeah.
So I thought that was like, because a lot of times when you think of being still, you think of like a secluded, quiet, scenery place, spa music in the background. But
I think moms especially of small children, have to be very creative in that. I remember years ago reading in a book this story about a mom, and this is probably, I picture in my mind like back in the 1940s. For some reason, this is how I picture it, but she, in the chaos of children and everything that she was trying to deal with, every time, once in a while, life would get just so overwhelming to her that she would take her apron and just pull it over her head and sit on her chair and pray. And when the kids ever came by and saw mom under her apron, they would just leave her alone. And I thought, I literally have a lock on the inside of my closet door. I asked my husband, put it on the inside, and it's a walk-in closet, and I had a little chair in there, and I would go in and sit. I'd have the kids, mom, just give me a minute. Just give me a minute. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Well, thank you all again so much for this great weekend, and I pray that it encourages you and really helps as we enter into a busy season. I feel like everybody's already very busy, and this is the time when it starts to ramp up. So stay calm. Remember that only one thing's necessary. All the other things, there's a lot of things that we can set aside or that can fall by the side that are really, if we really focus in on what's necessary, we start to realize that these things are not important. So keep your focus where it needs to be. Have a great trip, And we'll see you when you get back. All right.